January 5th, 2025. Kansas City woke up buried. 11 inches of snow had dropped overnight, the worst single-day dump the city had seen in 30 years. Wind gusts ripped through at 40 miles an hour. Traffic died. Power lines sagged. And by morning the temperature was falling through single digits toward a number nobody in Missouri should have to deal with. At the corner of East 8th and Tracy Avenue, a man froze to death. Andre Murray, who ran Hope Faith Ministries downtown, said it felt like losing family. Janelle Assman, a nurse with Care Beyond the Boulevard, spent the following weeks treating frostbite on fingers and toes that people hadn't felt go numb 2 weeks earlier. The shelters filled. The overflow shelters filled. The warming buses filled. And about 4 miles south of where that man died, tucked behind an abandoned car wash on a potholed strip of Prospect Avenue, a 44-year-old woman named Teresa Dusakova was sleeping. Not shivering. Not dying. Sleeping. Her neighbors in the camp, 7, 8 people depending on the week, had been calling her ideas stupid since October. The word they actually used more often was foolish, which is maybe worse because it carries pity in it. They said she was wasting her time. They said it would never work. One guy, Marcus, told her she was building her own coffin. The temperature inside that coffin, by the 6th night of the blizzard, was 63 degrees. Outside, it was 5 below zero. That is a 68-degree difference, produced by nothing but her own body and some garbage she pulled out of dumpsters. I need to tell you how she did it. But first you need to understand why everybody thought she'd lost her mind. Teresa grew up in Brno, Czech Republic, came to the States in 2007 with a boyfriend who turned out to be a worse bet than the economy that year. He left. She stayed. Worked housekeeping at a comfort inn near the airport for 11 years, then the hotel changed management in 2019, and the new company brought in their own crew. She got 2 weeks' notice and a handshake. The math fell apart fast after that. Rent in Kansas City isn't like rent in San Francisco, but it's not nothing. And when you're making $14.50 an hour, with no savings and your green card paperwork is a mess because the boyfriend who sponsored you vanished into Texas, the gap between employed and homeless is about 6 weeks. For Teresa, it was 5. She lived in her car first, a 2004 Honda Civic with 187,000 miles and a heater that worked maybe half the time. That lasted until the transmission went in February 2020 and she couldn't afford the repair. Then shelters. Then, after COVID hit and shelter beds became a lottery, the streets. By winter of 2023, she'd survived 3 Kansas City winters. She knew the tricks everybody knew. Layer up, find a bridge underside. Get a sleeping bag from the outreach van. Cardboard under you, always, because the ground eats your warmth faster than the air does. She knew all of that. And she also knew it wasn't enough. The problem with the standard approach, and I want to be specific here because people who've never slept outside in February tend to think of cold as one thing when it's actually 4 separate things trying to kill you, is that it fights one enemy at a time. Cardboard under you fights the ground. A sleeping bag fights the air. A bridge fights the wind. But nobody she'd met on the streets was fighting all 4 at once, in the same structure, with a plan. Teresa had a plan. She just couldn't get anyone to listen to it. The idea hit her in September 2024, which is the right month to start thinking about cold and the wrong month for anyone else to care. Kansas City in September is still warm. People in the camp were dealing with heat, not cold. So when Teresa started dragging home strange materials, they didn't take it seriously. Here's what she brought back over 3 weeks of dumpster runs, scrounging behind strip malls and construction sites along Troost Avenue and the Blue Parkway corridor. 14 large sheets of foil-faced polyisocyanurate foam board. Thick stuff, pink and silver, pulled from a commercial renovation dump site behind a gutted Applebee's. Most of the sheets were damaged, cracked, water-stained, cut at odd angles. Contractors throw this stuff away constantly. The undamaged version costs about $40 a sheet at Home Depot. The dumpster version costs a sore back and some scraped knuckles. Why this material? Because polyiso gives you R6 per inch. That number matters. R value is how you measure resistance to heat moving through something. Higher means better insulation, Fiberglass band in your house walls runs about R 3.5 per inch. Regular cardboard, which is what most homeless camps rely on, gives maybe R3 per inch if you stack it thick. Polyiso foam nearly doubles that. But the foam wasn't the foolish part. She also collected 9 emergency Mylar blankets. The thin silver ones you can buy at a dollar store or find in first aid kits. She got hers from a Red Cross supply drop at the Salvation Army on Linwood Boulevard after a spring tornado scare. And she gathered rolls of clear plastic sheeting, painter's drop cloths basically, found them in construction waste bins, plus duct tape. Lots of duct tape. The foolish part, the part that made Marcus shake his head and 2 women in the camp quietly suggest she might be having some kind of breakdown, was what she planned to do with all of it. She wasn't building a shelter. Everybody builds shelters. Tarp and poles, maybe pallet walls if you're ambitious. She'd done that herself before. Teresa was building a body-sized capsule, like a coffin. That's why Marcus used the word. Think about your bed at home for a second. You've got a room, and inside the room you've got a bed. And on the bed you've got blankets. The room might be 12 feet by 14 feet. Call it 1,300 cubic feet of air your heater has to warm. Your body puts out about 100 watts of heat at rest, roughly 350 BTU per hour, which sounds like a lot until you realize a space heater does 5,000. You can't heat a bedroom with your body. The room is too big. The walls leak too much. The math doesn't close. But what if the room were the size of you? That was Teresa's question, the one nobody wanted to hear. What if instead of insulating a tent, or a lean-to, or a pallet shack, all of which contain huge volumes of air that your body can't possibly warm, you built an insulated shell that fit tight around a single sleeping human? Just enough room to lie down, turn onto your side, pull your knees up slightly, maybe 7 feet long, 2.5 feet wide, 2 feet tall at the peak. Call it 35 cubic feet of air. 35 cubic feet versus 1,300. Your body is the same 100-watt heater either way. But in the small space, that heat has somewhere to go. It's not bleeding away into a cavernous room. It's trapped in a pocket right next to you, where it accumulates. This is the thing Teresa understood that her campmates didn't. The problem was never insulation alone. The problem was volume. You can wrap a tent in 10 blankets, and the tent is still too big for your body to heat. You've insulated a space you can't fill. But if you shrink the space down until it's barely bigger than you are, suddenly 100 watts is a real number. Suddenly one human body is a furnace. She called it the Krabbies. Czech word. It means box. She started building in the second week of October behind the car wash, used a flat concrete pad where the vacuum stations used to be. The pad was cracked and stained with oil, but it was level, and level matters when you're constructing something precise. First layer, cardboard, 6 sheets of corrugated doubled up, taped together at the seams. This went directly on the concrete. The ground is the biggest heat thief in any outdoor sleeping situation. Concrete in January will pull warmth out of you relentlessly because it has so much more mass than you do. The cold earth underneath acts like an infinite battery draining your heat. 6 layers of corrugated cardboard give about R6 on the floor. That was her base. Second layer on top of the cardboard, a sheet of polyiso foam, foil side up. Another, R6, and the foil does something beyond insulation. It bounces radiant heat back upward, toward the body. Heat comes off your skin in 2 ways, as warm air rising and as infrared radiation, which is essentially light you can't see. The foil catches that infrared and sends about 90% of it back at you. Most of that heat would otherwise sail straight through fabric and cardboard without slowing down. So her floor alone was running R12 with a reflective barrier. Nobody else in the camp had a floor above R3. Then she built the walls. This is where it got weird, and where the neighbors started paying attention, mostly to laugh. She cut the polyiso sheets into panels and assembled them into a box with a hinged lid. Picture a chest freezer turned upside down. A rectangular shell about 7 feet long, 2.5 feet wide, 2 feet tall at the center line. She beveled the top panels to a slight peak so rain and snow would slide off instead of pooling. Every seam was taped, then sealed with a second strip of tape over the first. She left no crack wider than the tape could cover. The inside walls got lined with Mylar, emergency blankets, silver side facing inward, taped flat against the foam with the reflective surface aimed at the sleeper. This created a second radiant barrier. Between the foil face of the polyiso and the Mylar liner, heat radiating off Teresa's body would bounce back and forth in that narrow gap, like a rubber ball between two walls, losing a little energy each bounce, but retaining most of it. Then she added the detail that drew the most ridicule. Between the Mylar liner and the foam wall, she taped a layer of clear plastic sheeting, painter's drop cloth. This was her vapor barrier. Moisture is the silent killer in any improvised shelter. A sleeping person exhales about 4.5 ounces of water vapor overnight. If that moisture gets into the insulation, it condenses, the insulation gets wet, and wet insulation loses more than half its R value. Your carefully built cocoon turns into a cold, wet bag. Teresa had seen this happen before. Her second winter, she'd built a decent cardboard shelter under the eye, 670 viaduct, packed it with blankets, and within 3 nights the inside was dripping. The blankets soaked through. She woke up colder than if she'd slept in the open. The plastic layer stopped that. Water vapor from her breath and skin would condense on the smooth plastic surface instead of soaking into the foam. In the morning, she could wipe it down with a rag. The insulation stayed dry night after night. This is the same principle behind vapor barriers in residential construction. Builders put a plastic membrane between the drywall and the insulation for the same reason. But nobody Teresa talked to on the streets had thought to apply it to a sleeping shelter. Marcus watched her tape the plastic sheeting in place on a Thursday afternoon in late October. That's when he made the coffin comment. He wasn't being cruel exactly. He was scared for her. It looked like she was sealing herself into a box. She was. The lid was the hardest part. It needed to close tight enough to hold heat, but open fast enough to get out in an emergency. She hinged it with strips of duct tape along one long edge and weighted the opposite edge with a sawed-off broom handle that sat in a fabric loop. To get in, she'd lift the lid from the foot end, slide in feet first on her back, then pull the lid down over herself. The broom handle clicked into the loop and held it snug. From outside, it looked like a ratty silver and pink rectangle sitting on a concrete slab behind a dead car wash. Not impressive, not even interesting if you didn't know what was inside. Inside was different. She'd layered the bottom with a foam sleeping pad she'd found at a Goodwill on Independence Avenue. The closed cell kind, the green one every camper recognizes. On top of that, a sleeping bag rated to 20 degrees that she'd had since her first winter. On top of the sleeping bag, a wool blanket someone had donated at the warming center on Truman Road. And one more thing, a small ventilation hole at the head end, about the diameter of a quarter, angled downward so rain couldn't drip in. This was the detail that kept the whole system from becoming a death trap. Seal a person in an insulated box with no airflow and 2 things go wrong. First, CO2 builds up. Second, moisture has nowhere to go except into the insulation. The vent hole let her exhale without fogging the interior, let CO2 bleed off, and provided just enough air exchange to keep the Mylar walls from dripping. It cost her some heat. A quarter-sized hole is a thermal leak. But the alternative was suffocation or a soaked interior. She'd thought about this. She'd thought about all of it. Total construction time, 11 days of on and off work. Total cost, $0. Total respect from the camp, about the same. The first real test came November 17th. Overnight low of 22 degrees. Not brutal by Kansas City standards, but cold enough to notice. Cold enough that 3 people in the camp couldn't sleep and ended up walking to the 24-hour McDonald's on Prospect to sit in the dining room until sunrise. Teresa climbed into the Krabby's at 9:30 that night, wearing long underwear, wool socks, and a fleece pullover. She pulled the lid down, clicked the broom handle into place, and lay still. Within 20 minutes, she could feel the temperature changing. Here's what was happening inside the physics. Her body at rest was dumping about 350 BTU per hour into 35 cubic feet of enclosed air. The foam walls were blocking conductive heat loss at R6 per surface. The foil and Mylar were bouncing her radiant heat output, about half her total heat loss, back at her. The cardboard and foam floor was stopping the concrete from sucking her dry, and the sealed seams were killing convective drafts. All 4 channels of heat loss, conduction, convection, radiation, evaporation, were being fought simultaneously. In an open sleeping bag under a bridge, the same 350 BTU per hour would scatter into the wind and be gone. The math never closes in an open environment. The body just can't keep up. In the Krabice, the math closed. By midnight, the air inside the capsule had stabilized around 55 degrees. Teresa was warm. Not survivably, not dead warm. Warm, warm. Comfortable warm. She unzipped the sleeping bag because she was too hot. She unzipped the sleeping bag in November, in Kansas City, sleeping behind an abandoned car wash. Nobody believed her in the morning. Through the rest of November and into December, the temperatures dropped and the Krabice held. 20-degree nights, 15, 10. The interior stayed between 50 and 60 degrees, depending on how cold it got outside and how well she'd sealed that night's entry. The warmer she was inside, the less she moved, the less she sweated, the drier the system stayed. A self-reinforcing loop. She started keeping a thermometer inside, a cheap one from Dollar Tree, the kind with a suction cup meant for sticking on a window. She'd check it in the morning before opening the lid and memorize the number. People in the camp noticed she wasn't coming to the warming centers anymore. She wasn't getting on the outreach van at 6 a.m. looking wrecked and exhausted the way everybody else was. She was coming out of her box at 7:30, stretching, walking to the gas station for coffee, looking like someone who'd actually slept. That got attention. Marcus came over in early December, asked if he could see inside. She showed him. He touched the interior Mylar wall. It was warm to the touch. The outside of the box was cold, almost the same temperature as the air. All the heat was staying inside. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he asked if she could build one for him. She built 2 more before Christmas. One for Marcus, one for a woman named Charlene who had a bad knee and couldn't make the walk to the warming center at Guadalupe Centers on Cesar Chavez when the wind picked up. Charlene was 61 years old and had been sleeping in a tent with 4 blankets and still waking up shivering every 2 hours. The first night Charlene slept in her capsule. She cried, not from cold, from the disorientation of not being cold for the first time in 3 winters. She told Teresa it felt wrong, like she was cheating. Building the copies taught Teresa something she hadn't expected. Size matters, and it's personal. Marcus was 6'1". Teresa was 5'6". His capsule needed to be 9 inches longer and 4 inches wider to fit him, which meant more interior volume, which meant his body had to heat more air. His overnight temperatures ran about 8 degrees lower than hers, everything else equal. Still, 50-something degrees instead of 60. Still livable. But the tighter the fit, the warmer the box. She started calling this the coffin rule, which Marcus didn't appreciate. The best insulation in the world doesn't matter if the space inside is too big for one human body to heat. Tighter is warmer, period. The closer the walls are to your skin, the less air you're asking your body to warm, and the higher the temperature you can maintain. There's a line, too tight, and you can't turn over, can't move, can't get out in an emergency. But Teresa ran right up to that line and stopped 6 inches from it. That 6-inch clearance was the design. Not an accident. Not a guess. A choice she'd worked out by November. Then January 5th hit. The blizzard dumped 11 inches. Marcus heard about the man who died at 8th and Tracy from a guy at Hope Faith. Charlene heard about it from the outreach nurse Janelle Assman, who came through 2 days later checking on people's extremities. The camp went quiet for a while. Death does that, especially death that close. That's similar to your own situation. That night the temperature dropped to -2. Teresa climbed into the Krabby at 8:40, pulled the lid, clicked the broom handle, lay still. By morning the thermometer read 63 degrees inside. Outside, -5. 68 degrees of difference. She stared at the thermometer for a long time. She thought about the man on Tracy Avenue. She thought about the fact that she was lying here, overheating slightly in a box made of garbage, and he was dead. The difference between them wasn't toughness, wasn't luck, wasn't will. It was geometry. It was the decision to make the space small enough that one body could fill it with heat. That's the thing nobody wanted to hear back in October. The trick isn't better insulation. It isn't thicker walls or more blankets or a warmer sleeping bag. All of those help, but none of them fix the real problem, which is that a tent or a lean-to or a pallet shack is too big. The human body is a furnace, a real one, putting out enough heat to keep you alive and comfortable in Arctic conditions, but only if you don't waste that heat on empty space. The krabice works because it's small. Foolishly, embarrassingly, claustrophobically small. The size is the feature. The size is the whole thing. The cold didn't let up. January 2025 in Kansas City turned into something nobody had scheduled. After the blizzard came a week of single digits. Then a brief warm-up. Then another plunge. On January 22nd, the daily record fell, -8 degrees Fahrenheit. Teresa checked the thermometer that morning. 60 degrees inside. 40 days, from the blizzard on January 5th through mid-February, the krabice held. Not every night was -5. Some were in the teens, some in the 20s. On those nights, her interior temps ran higher, 65, 68, occasionally 70 when it was just cold enough outside to justify the sealed box, but warm enough that her body heat outpaced the losses easily. The 68-degree differential she recorded on the worst nights was the ceiling, the extreme case, the number that only shows up when outside temps crash into the negatives and everything you've built gets tested for real. Some nights she didn't seal it fully, left the lid cracked a few inches because the interior got too warm and she couldn't breathe comfortably. A cracked lid on a night when it's 12 degrees outside. She told Marcus about it and he laughed out loud, which was the first time she'd heard him laugh about anything related to the krabice. Word spread through the camp in a way that wasn't organized. Nobody held a meeting. There wasn't a moment where everyone gathered around and agreed Teresa had been right all along. It was more gradual than that, more grudging. People saw her sleeping through nights that drove them to the warming bus. People noticed that she wasn't sick. Kansas City winters wreck homeless people's health, respiratory infections, frostbite, hypothermia events that don't quite kill you but leave your body damaged in ways that make the next winter harder. Teresa didn't get sick that winter. She credits the krabice. Maybe it's that simple. By late January, 4 people in the camp had capsules. Teresa built 2 more with materials she scrounged, and 2 that people built themselves after she walked them through the layering sequence. Floor first, cardboard, then polyiso foil up. Walls, polyiso panels, taped tight. Interior, Mylar reflective side facing in. Vapor barrier, plastic sheeting between the Mylar and the foam. Vent hole, quarter-sized, angled down. Lid, hinged, weighted. Not everybody's worked as well as Teresa's. The guy who built his own, Raymond, left gaps at 2 of the seams because he got impatient with the taping. His overnight temps ran 10 degrees lower, still warmer than a tent, still better than nothing, but leaky seams let warm air out and cold air in, and the convective loss wipes out a lot of the radiant and conductive gains. Teresa told him to tape the seams. He said it was good enough. She said good enough was how people lose fingers. He taped the seams. Here's the thing that sticks with me. Outreach workers spend every winter handing out coats, blankets, hand warmers, sleeping bags. Good people doing real work. But every donation is about adding insulation. Nobody thinks about volume. Teresa's sleeping bag was a $20 thrift store find rated to 20 degrees. Inside the krabice, that bag performed better than a $400 expedition bag would have inside an open tent. Because the bag wasn't doing the whole job. 5 other layers were handling most of the thermal load before the bag even got involved. The cheapest materials in the world, assembled in the right order and the right geometry, beat expensive gear in the wrong geometry. That's the part nobody wants to hear. It means the answer was sitting in the dumpster behind the Applebee's the whole time. February arrived. The cold loosened in fits and starts the way it does in the Midwest. Teresa kept sleeping in the krabice through March. She started working on a collapsible version. Panels that slot together with notched edges so the whole thing can come apart in 15 minutes if the camp gets swept. Kansas City does sweeps. If you can't move your shelter, you lose it. Last I heard, in late March, she wasn't sure the collapsible design would hold. What I do know is that 4 people survived a winter that killed at least one person within 4 miles of where they slept. They survived it without electricity, without fuel, without a building, without a heater. They survived it with garbage and tape. And one woman's obsessive, foolish, mocked, correct idea. The physics don't care whether you believe them. 100 watts from a resting human body. In a bedroom, that heat disappears. In a 35 cubic foot capsule with R12 walls and reflective surfaces, it accumulates until the inside stabilizes somewhere between 50 and 65 degrees. On the worst night of the worst blizzard Kansas City had seen in 30 years, it stabilized at 63 degrees inside with -5 outside. 68 degrees of difference. From body heat. From a foolish idea. I keep circling back to Marcus and the coffin comment. Because he wasn't wrong, not exactly. The Krabby does look like a coffin. It's built like one. It's the size of one. You climb in and close the lid over your face, and the world goes quiet and small and dark. But a coffin holds a dead person. The Krabby keeps a living person alive. The whole difference between those two things. The whole gap between dying on a sidewalk at 8th and Tracy and waking up at 7:30 to walk to the gas station for coffee is 6 inches of foam and some tape, and one woman who refused to believe the space had to be big. Teresa Dusakova didn't invent anything. Mountaineers have known about body heat capsules for a century. Alan Innes Taylor documented a 74-degree temperature lift inside a snow shelter in the Canadian Arctic back in 1957, using nothing but packed snow and the occupant's body heat. The Boy Scouts of America's cold weather training program in Minnesota teaches kids to build quinjees that run 60 to 70 degrees warmer than outside air. The physics are old. The math is settled. What Teresa did was translate it from mountaineering textbooks that homeless people don't read, from survival courses that cost $300, from engineering tables that nobody brings to a warming center, into a pile of dumpster foam and dollar store blankets behind a dead car wash in Kansas City, Missouri. She translated it into something a person with no money, no tools, and no address could build in 11 days and sleep in for 40 nights through the worst winter her neighbors had seen. They called it foolish. She called it the krabice. The thermometer called it 63 degrees.